I have a very good friend who has had a lot of loss in her life. More than seems fair for one lifetime, really. When she was a young woman, both of her parents died. And more recently, in the time that I've known her, her older brother died. And she's just my age, so it seems like a lot of loss, a lot of profound loss for one lifetime. And this friend and I were having dinner last week, and as we were sitting across the table with our children sort of distracting us on either side, we attempted to have a serious conversation. And she asked what I was preaching about this Sunday, and I said that I was preaching about the conclusion of the story of Ruth. And I said I wasn't sure at that point where the sermon was going to go, but that I knew that I had the end of the story. And so she said, well, tell me about the story, and then maybe it will help you think about where the sermon should go. And so I told her about the story that we've been traveling throughout Lent, and I'll tell you a little recap too, because we haven't all been here along the way. So here's what I told my friend. I told her how at the beginning of the book of Ruth, there was a famine in the land of Israel. And Naomi went with her husband Elimelech from Bethlehem to the land of Moab so that they could escape the famine. And while they were there, their two sons both met and married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. But then, while they were there in the land of Moab, I told her about how Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And shortly thereafter, her two sons also died, leaving Naomi and Orpah and Ruth alone. And this was a vulnerable position for these three women to be in, because as Beth talked about last week, the society, the ancient society in which they lived, was highly patriarchal. For three women to be left alone, unattached to a man, was to leave them extremely vulnerable. The system was one of systemic oppression. They needed to be connected to a man to feel safe, to survive, to be protected. And yet these three women were not. I told my friend how Naomi decided that she was going to travel back to Bethlehem. And she told her daughters-in-law that they should stay in the land of Moab, that they should stay in their own homeland. And Orpah decided to do that. But that Ruth clung to her mother-in-law and said, I'm going with you. Where you go, I will go. And so Ruth and Naomi together traveled back to Bethlehem in this dangerous, vulnerable situation because they were alone in this patriarchal society. And they got back to Bethlehem, and while they were there, they needed to figure out how they were going to survive. So Ruth went and decided that she would try to glean some extra wheat from the fields of those who were the wealthy landowners. And so she went out into the field, and by happenstance, she ended up in the field of a man named Boaz. And when she gets home and tells Naomi about this, Naomi is very excited because it turns out that Boaz is related to Elimelech. He is part of their next of kin. And so she tells Ruth this, and Ruth goes to the threshing room floor, and as Beth talked about last week, again, in that difficult society, pushing back on the oppression in which they lived, Ruth is forced to resort to using her body to win the attention and the affection of Boaz. Now, that's not to say that Boaz could not also be a kind and a good man, but we see at the core of this story this difficult power dynamic. And so Ruth does, in fact, get Boaz's attention, but Boaz says to her that there's another man who might be closer next of kin, and so before he can just agree to marry her, he has to haggle with this man over who's going to end up with Elimelech's property, and also Ruth, who is basically also property. So I told my friend how Boaz and this other next of kin talk it over, and the other man says, you know, I'm not going to take the land, or Ruth, so you can take it. And that's where we've picked up for the end of the story. That at the end of the story that we have come to, we get to the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, and then also we have the birth of their son Obed, who restores his grandmother Naomi's joy. And we hear in the scripture that Beth just read how Naomi cuddles the infant Obed on her chest, and her joy is restored. Her hope is restored. And so that's what I told my friend as we were sitting across the table at the restaurant. It was a Mexican restaurant, so we had our chips and salsa and all our things around us. And I told her the whole story of the book of Ruth. And she thought about it and she said, you know, the end of that story makes me think about something about life, which is that so much of what we do is try to navigate what it is to feel and experience great joy, even as we're present to our pain. So much of life is about navigating that walk, what it is to experience and feel great joy, even as we're aware of our pain, our past hurts, the things that have come up in our story. And I think that that's really true in Naomi's story. You know, we sort of begin and end the book of Ruth with Naomi. We meet Naomi first, and then we close with her, holding the baby Obed, her hope being restored. But what we know about life is that one moment of joy, no matter how great, does not erase the pain that we've experienced, doesn't erase the difficult moments, but it can begin to help heal and make whole our hearts. I don't think we can imagine that for Naomi, that the birth of the baby Obed, this birth of new life and hope, and as her friends tell her, security, her friends say, now you'll have a next of kin. Now you'll have that security in this society that you were lacking. Now you have hope. And Naomi does. But I don't think we can imagine that for Naomi, this joyful moment, no matter how great, and anybody who's held a new baby can imagine maybe how Naomi was feeling, but no matter how great that moment felt to her, it doesn't erase the pain that she's had. It certainly doesn't take away the fact that she lost her husband or her 2 sons, that she had to say goodbye to her daughter-in-law Orpah back in the land of Moab. Those things don't erase what happened, but she's walking that path. She's navigating what it is to experience this great joy, even as she's present with all that's come before. And the same could be said about Ruth. I don't think we can imagine that for Ruth, this moment of great joy, or marrying the undoubtedly good and kindly and honest Boaz, is going to erase or take away the pain of losing her husband, or the pain and worry and insecurity of being alone with her mother-in-law in this extremely difficult society, or the pain of being worried about her security, feeling those forces of oppression that were built into the society, pushing her to make choices, pushing her to feel that perhaps she only had one choice. This moment of joy doesn't erase all that's come before for Ruth, but it does begin to help heal and make whole her heart. So much of our life is like that. We're trying to navigate what it is, to feel and experience great joy, those moments that heal and make whole our hearts, even as we remain present to the totality of our story. And in this story, we meet the baby Obed only for a moment. Only for a moment. And yet we get a very real sense. We get a very real sense that he is going to lead this family forward. That he is going to lead them in a new beginning. That he is going to be a new branch of a family tree. A little child to lead them forward. You know, one thing that's kind of neat about the book of Ruth is that list of names that Beth ended with. Because at the book of Ruth, what we find out about Obed is that he is the father of Jesse. And Jesse is a name that we see again in the book of the prophet Isaiah. We see it in a passage that we typically read at the very beginning of the Advent season, where it says, "A root shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding. And the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and a little child will lead them." In the story of Ruth, we meet Obed, the little child who has come to help heal and make whole his family's heart. And from Obed, we get Jesse. And from Jesse, we get David, and from David, we get Jesus. And so it's kind of fitting, actually, that the end of the book of Ruth, this little child to lead them forward, leads us back to the story of Jesus. Because even though our journey with the book of Ruth is coming to an end this week, our journey through the season of Lent is not. Because next week is Palm Sunday. And we shift our attention from the story of Ruth to the stories of Jesus' final week of his life. And with that, we come to the realization that we are already preparing ourselves, that even next week, as we remember the triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem, the joy that people experienced as they saw Jesus coming into the city, there were already powers of oppression and hate that were at work, ready to change that story, ready to break the hearts of all those who knew Jesus, ready to break our own hearts as we remember it once again. Part of the Lenten journey is to navigate what it is to be present with the reality that we are anticipating a great joy at Easter. But we also have to be incredibly present with the pain, the hurt, the sorrow, and the loss. That's that balancing act of life. And a little child leads us from one story into the next. From Obed, we get Jesse. From Jesse, we get King David. And ultimately, from King David, we get to Jesus. And a little child will lead us. Now, one thing that I also think is very cool about the end of the book of Ruth, and it might only be me that thinks it's cool because it's sort of a nerdy minister thing, so maybe at least one other person will think it's cool because Beth probably will. But at the beginning of the book of Matthew, when you get the genealogy of Jesus, there's something really interesting in it. You know, there's a lot of genealogies in the Bible which just are long lists of who is related to who, and in almost every genealogy what you get is people, dads who are dads of other dads who are dads of other dads, and this is no knock on dads, but that's how they tend to go, from man to man to man throughout the generations. In Matthew, we get something different. We get mostly men, but 5 women. 5 women appear in the genealogy of Jesus, one being his own mother Mary, who was herself sort of an unusual choice, an unexpected choice, given her poverty and her low station in life. So she's in this genealogy, and we know that she's sort of a surprising choice to become the mother of God here on earth. But you know who else is in that genealogy? You probably do. You probably know where this is going. Ruth. Ruth is in the genealogy of Jesus. And as Beth said last week, Ruth is from the land of Moab, which was a sort of despised, looked down upon land compared to Israel. So for Ruth, a Moabite woman, to end up in the genealogy of Jesus is pretty fascinating. But if we think about it in terms of the fact that the story of Ruth is a story of protest, it's a story about pushing back on some of those powers of oppression, on some of those powers of darkness, of some of those powers of hate, of injustice. If you think about the fact that the story of Ruth is a story of protest, so too is the story of Jesus. And so to find Ruth right there in Jesus' genealogy tells us something. Tells us something about the person that that little child Jesus was destined to be. Somebody who was going to fight back against those powers of oppression. He didn't come from a kingly lineage, he came from a lineage of regular people. People who had been walking this human journey, people who had been suffering, feeling pain, experiencing moments of great joy, trying to navigate that and balance it out. People who had been listening for the voice of God to keep calling them forward in love. And experiencing that great love in their lives in all sorts of ways that might continue to heal and to make whole their hearts. And it's a little child who brings us from one story to the next. And so, what should we take with us? What should we take with us as we leave the book of Ruth this week? No doubt throughout the experience of studying Ruth so far, there have been moments that have spoken to each one of us in different ways. But as we look at this ending portion of the story, I think one thing that is important for us to take with us is the reality that there is still a little childlike part of each one of us that's leading us forward, that's helping us to navigate some of those moments of pain, those moments of joy. A childlike part of us that speaks, calls us forward. A childlike part of us that is not afraid to look at the world in new ways. A childlike part of us that is not afraid to take on the powers or the way things are and say, why do they have to be this way? A childlike part of us that's not afraid to ask questions, to have eyes wide with wonder, to reach out to those around us. Paulo Coelho once said, children can teach adults 3 things. Arguably, they could probably teach adults more than 3 things, but we'll go with his 3. He said, they can teach adults how to be happy for no reason at all. And they can teach adults how to be busy all the time. And they can teach adults how to fight with their heart's desire for the thing you most need, how to advocate for yourself. Each one of us has that childlike part within us. It's a part of our story, and it's a part of us that's still leading us forward. Each one of us has known moments of pain, like Naomi, like Ruth. They're part of our story. They should not and cannot be erased. The totality of your story, the story of the bruises and the bumps, the hurts and the aches along the way, the things that you have borne, as much as the joys you have known, have made you the person that you are at this point on your journey. So honor that. Tell your story. And allow that childlike part of yourself, that childlike, God-like, Jesus-like part, to continue to lead you forward. To continue to open your eyes wide with wonder, to continue to allow you to be on the lookout for those moments of joy, even in the simplest things. Allow that childlike part of you the freedom to heal and make whole the bumps and the bruises on your heart. But tell your story. Share your story. Today we close out Ruth and Naomi's story. And we anticipate Jesus' story. The Palm Sunday story, the Easter story. We move from one to the next, and it reminds us that what the world also needs are your stories. To connect you with one another, to open ourselves to one another. When we share our stories, we're sharing who we are, where we've been, where God is calling us to. There are connections in our stories. So share them. The world needs your story. The world needs your commitment. The world needs your love, your care, your passion, your energy, the things that make you uniquely you. And the world needs for that hope, that little childlike sense of hope, to be born again and again and again in you and in me. And it is that childlike sense of hope that we carry within us that can lead us forward. Following God's call, following God's faithful promise of love. The world needs your unique self. So tell your story. Allow your heart to be open. Follow the path forward. Amen.